Kia ora everyone, I'm Grant Habgood, General Manager for National Client Solutions at Beyond Recruitment. We're New Zealand's largest Kiwi-owned recruitment agency. And today we'll be discussing an important and what I feel is a timely topic, immigration and the evolving visa requirements in New Zealand, particularly the changes Immigration New Zealand has been making to their guidelines and rules over the last 6 months for employers. These include things such as expansion of the green list and updated salary thresholds for accredited employers. So to help us navigate today's conversation, I've got an expert that knows a lot more than I do on the topic. And as such, I do also need to give a disclaimer. So the information is current that we'll be talking about as of the 26th of September 2024. And this information is for educational or informative purposes only. Immigration advice won't be provided, nor will individual cases be discussed. The information does not substitute for legal advice. There's no substitute for legal advice. If you're unsure about your immigration situation, please seek advice from a licensed immigration advisor or lawyer, like the gentleman we have talking to today, and community law centres or citizens advice bureaus may also be able to assist you depending on your circumstances. So without further ado, Shush, how are you, mate?
Yeah, we're busy with all the changes, and it's busy period at the moment, and I think we'll still be busy next year. So keeping busy.
All the more reason for us to be, or myself to be, very appreciative of you taking time for this conversation. So you're a senior associate at Copeland Ashcroft, I believe. So you can tell us a little bit about your role and your company.
Yeah, so I guess I'll start with Copeland Ashcroft. So at our core, we provide workplace law services. So that's your employment, health and safety, and immigration services. At the moment, I'm helping with leading the immigration practice. So that's sort of one of the three core areas that we provide professional and specialist services in.
Brilliant. We're talking to the right guy. Okay, so but before we get into some of the more granular details about changes to things like AEWV and other visa requirements and what that means for employers, perhaps let's take a little bit of a top-down or bird's eye view of what the situation is with the migrant net flows into New Zealand and out of New Zealand. So if I'm looking at the 2024 June year-to-date data from Stats New Zealand about net migration numbers, we had 204,500 migrant arrivals, which was only slightly down on last year, down 1%. Had a lot more migrant departures, 131,000, and that was actually up 33% year on year. We're still at a net migration positive number of 73,000. What I'm reading in front of me, I haven't memorized this, of course, but what I'm seeing here. So what does that tell us, do you think? From your side?
I think in terms of a bigger picture, what we're seeing is there was really relaxed immigration policy settings over the last 2 years. That was sort of phase one of immigration / the government's reopening of the border. And now what we're seeing is potentially the tightening of sort of the immigration setting, at least for migrant visa holders. Combined with potentially other sort of macro factors with our economy and so forth, and potentially, now more of an outflow of people from New Zealand to other places.
That makes sense. Do you anecdotally, or have you got any sense, as in from let's look at an immigration competition? We essentially compete for highly skilled people against countries like Canada, Australia, the UK often. Do you think our settings, is it making it relatively easier or harder for businesses to employ people from overseas, albeit if compared to some of those nations that we might be competing for talent for?
Well, I think overall there's some rules that make us a bit more competitive than Australia. So for example, if you're looking to apply for residence in Australia, the age cutoff is around 40 46. So once you hit 46 in Australia, you can't apply for permanent residence for your employment pathways. Whereas in New Zealand, we're a little bit wider in the sense that, if you're 55, we'll still allow you to apply, but once you turn 56, that's sort of the age cutoff. So we've got some things going for us. And then initially, when the tap was turned on, it was really quick. So the government at the time promised sort of 10 working days sort of processing timeframes, and that was really good. Now it's changed. It's in terms of the actual processing time, I think it's sort of dragged out and stretched out to around 9 weeks processing time just for the job check application, which was supposed to take 10 days initially, and then there's another extra 8 to 9 weeks just for the work visa to process. So it's taking a bit longer now, and I think sort of from the government's perspective, it allows them to complete more thorough checks. So previously, when the tap was sort of turned on in terms of immigration, the checks were very light touch, almost automated. And now, you've got actual people, actually looking at applications, which is taking more time and so forth, along with, some tweaked policy, which sort of restricts immigration. And we could talk about that later with, those policy changes. And so, that have occurred in the last 6 months.
And that, we're going delving into this a little bit further, that extra time to process, has that been one of the reasons why it's become a bit more expensive, do you think? As in certainly the costs of some of these visas has gone up, hasn't it, quite significantly?
Yeah. So the government announced, I think it was quite recently this year, that the application fees would be increasing from the 1st of October 2024. Now, to the best of my understanding, that was actually budgeted for when the coalition government had come into effect, and they needed to, in essence, find a way of paying for potential tax cuts potentially to other sectors and industries. Now, just if we were to talk about that, that's like it could take some time in itself.
Can of worms there,
But just my 2 cents is I'm not actually sure at the moment whether the increase in application fees is bad or not, because on one hand, the government should be getting some money to help with building New Zealand's infrastructure, so that when people land in New Zealand, the infrastructure is there, and can accept, not just a worker, but also their families. So, for example, in Australia, the application fees are a lot higher, and then there's all these levies that you have to pay for. Whereas I think New Zealand is, potentially catching up to that with this application fee increase. So that's, on one hand, it's good, from a government perspective, they get to generate more revenue from that. From a I guess from a migrant perspective, it's a bit of it's a more difficult thing to absorb in terms of a cost. For example, just the work visa fee is increasing from the career employer work visa fee is increasing from $750 to around $1,540, which is a lot more.
Yeah. No, that makes sense. And I guess one thought comes to mind: if processing times are longer and the fees are going up, well, it's a big commitment for someone, for a family or a migrant to be coming into the country. So it might sound a bit of a strange thing to say, but as in terms of, you're certainly going to get the serious contenders, or in your line of work, people who are coming to you from a migrant perspective, wanting to understand more about sponsorship. You don't get any tie kickers, I guess, the more expensive it gets, or the processing times, and people are serious about living here.
Yeah, that we are seeing a bit of that. Like, I guess the inquiries are from people who are more able to pay the application fee. So I think that is another helpful way to spin the increase on application fees.
Yeah, potentially. Okay, let's delve a bit deeper into the changes, especially with, at least we can segregate it, like put it into different categories in the AEWV. Thinking about some of more of the changes over the last 6 months, what are some of the other things that we've seen? Because this is one that, with our client pool, companies that we work with, quite often some feedback anecdotally we get from them is that, wow, it's actually a bit hard to keep up with all the changes, because things, goalposts tend to move fairly drastically. So what else has changed? What are the requirements that we're seeing coming in?
Oh, there have been so many changes, and like sort of I mentioned before, there'll be even more changes next year. So I hope you and your clients are ready. Some of the big ones were rolled out in April this year. So the first one is the minimum skills wage, minimum skills threshold. So this is a new requirement. So anyone coming into New Zealand to apply for an accredited employer work visa will need to have at least a bachelor's qualification, 3 years of relevant work experience, a level 4 to 6 qualification with NZQA, and etc. Now, in essence, what that sort of minimum skills threshold does is it presents a hurdle for migrants coming to New Zealand. So especially those that are working in sort of your cleaner slash chef slash sort of roles in the hospitality industry, like let's say your commercial cleaners, it makes it really difficult for employers to sort of utilize the immigration setting to recruit workers. So it adds another hurdle. That's probably one of the biggest. There's been a few more compliance hurdles added in. So for example, there is a shorter maximum stay period for ANSCO skill level 4 to 5 roles. So again, I guess more specifically targeting the hospitality and tourism industry, where you've got those, let's say commercial cleaners and so forth, what the government is sort of saying, look, we don't want them here for longer than 3 years practically. You should only have them technically for 3 years. Now I'm not sure how long these settings will last, but what it does mean is there is more compliance for your employers that utilize sort of roles that are ANSCO skill level 4 to 5, and it means, for example, for some of these employers who have let's say sponsored a worker in 2022 for a 3-year work visa that's about to expire, let's say in early 2025 or sometime in 2025, that company will then now need to invest into looking for another migrant worker, because this migrant worker will, unless you promote them into some kind of management role, will no longer be able to apply for an accredited employer work visa if, for example, they're still working as a commercial cleaner or something like that.
Okay, so there's a lot going on there. Sure. So what's the best way, do you think, for employers to stay abreast of all of these changes? And again, this is something our client pool asks us quite a lot around. Well, a lot's going on, or what we actually are seeing is that a lot of companies would basically put it in a bit of the too hard basket to bring someone on sponsor, or at least have work with the AEWV system essentially. So how do you bridge that gap? What do you think is the best way for a client to stay informed about all of these changes?
Yeah, that's a great question. Well, we firstly got a newsletter, so I'll share that later on. And if you have any clients that want to sign up, it's free. We send out monthly sort of recaps of all the changes. The biggest sort of recommendation is probably to get some professional advice. We see so many clients in the corporate space that try to do it themselves at the moment. And I guess I'll need to add some context. Like before April this year, the processing of most things was, I think, in my opinion, a lot lighter touch. There was a lot less scrutiny being applied. And then after April this year, it's almost like there was an internal directive within government which said, look, we're tightening the taps, and we need to be extra sure that all of the employers and migrants that are coming into New Zealand meet all the requirements that we've set out in our policy. So I guess just going back to it, I think we're seeing a lot of employers get caught out by the tightening of the tap. And then what that usually means is that, they potentially are putting themselves in a sort of like in a snowball effect, where if they start the job check application wrong, and then the worker submits a accredited employer work visa, they're incurring more financial costs because they might need to restart the entire process again. Had they, for example, gotten professional advice at the start, and sort of mapped everything out for them, they would actually be spending less compared to getting it wrong or gotten it wrong in the first instance, and then having to redo everything. And in addition to that, there's all those financial business costs going on in the background, because they don't have the worker here generating, let's say, that revenue for them, and now they're having to pay more money while they're waiting longer for the person to come into New Zealand to start work. And
it can be extra strain on existing team members, or fewer hands trying to do more work and that kind of thing. I think you're right. A bit of additional cost up front can save a lot of pain probably down the track of it. Very good point. Very good point.
Yeah, exactly.
And with the green list, so adjustments of the green list and the commentary that you're mentioning about different job types, and also this has to link in with the state of the economy at the moment, because look, unemployment is creeping up. There's a few more people available in the workforce, but what areas are you seeing in terms of demand for your services from businesses in terms of where they're actually looking to bring people in? And this is all considering immigration settings changing and everything like that. Like, what areas are you seeing the most demand? What industries?
We're still
what type of
seeing
positions?
a bit of work in the IT space and the aged healthcare sector. We're still seeing a bit of work in um, I think companies that have government contracts. We're seeing still a bit of work there, but we've definitely seen a noticeable sort of change in the work that we do. So initially, for example, in 2022, 2023, the workers, okay, we've got all of these roles that we need to fill in, we need to bring all these workers in. And now the change in work has been more, look, we've got all these people now in New Zealand, how do we look after them? What do we do to future plan, right? Because, with some of these immigration settings, we need to, one, understand, how long we can keep these workers for. And if we can't keep these workers for a long period based on what they're currently doing, is there anything else that we can do to help them keep, to remain in New Zealand longer? So let's say potential role changes, promotions, and so forth. So we've sort of had a change in sort of, how we're working with the same sort of organizations and so forth.
It makes a lot of sense. And the government certainly seems there's been a lens in it. It's been in the media. It's fairly highly publicized in terms of migrant exploitation, essentially, and really tightening the compliance and governance around that. Do you think the standards are improving in that area? And I think the worst case scenario, which we've seen in the media, is people coming into the country essentially with promises of work, but there not being any, and having to figure out the next steps from there. Do you think we're doing a good job with that, or heading in the right direction?
I think that, with the tightening of the tap, the government's definitely doing a lot of a better job of making sure that there's less migrant exploitation that's present. I think the difficulty with the government is, we work with a lot of good employers, and anything that they do wrong, we sort of advise immigration straight away. But the tricky part is immigration needs to identify those people that are doing wrong, because those are the companies that just keep their heads down, never say anything, and it's really hard to find. But I think generally the government's doing a really good job with. I think recently they did sort of like a joint operation in Queenstown when they issued a few infringement offences and so forth. But I think they're also still, I guess, in an early phase of testing the new policy with the infringement offences. I think there's still some tweaks that they probably need to work through with the different sort of powers that they have. For example, one of the powers and protection mechanisms that was put in so that when Immigration New Zealand or MB investigates an employer for potential, migrant exploitation, that the workers would be protected. But what we're finding, for example, is because immigration have so many wide powers available for them, they can just bypass that protection mechanism. So I think there'll be a phase where immigration sort of works through the new powers that they have. But I think just generally they're doing a good job of finding and identifying and then sort of dealing with migrant exploitation. And the setting now is, I think, a lot better than what it was when the borders were opening in around 2022.
Excellent, nice. And do you foresee as one thing that we are potentially having more of these conversations with clients when we talk about these talent shortages we had post-COVID, say 18 months ago, up until about 18 months ago, potentially almost coming back when we look at those net migration numbers, good people essentially leaving the country, and we've had a lot of restructuring in different organizations, industries across the country due to economic climate. But what does tend to happen is organizations can potentially cut a bit too deep into the muscle, and if the labor pool has essentially shrunk, or we've got more net migration outflows externally, that will create another talent shortages. So would you foresee us moving into that type of climate, and I don't think it will be this side of the year, but potentially mid next year, into an almost another labour shortage? And what would your advice be to organisations who might be looking to bring in talent from outside of the country in order to counter that?
I guess, yeah, there's a lot there to unwrap. I guess firstly, yeah, I think it's the messaging is totally correct. I think, a lot of companies are working with the message survive until 2025 or potentially even longer. And I think I just with those companies, I think it's quite important to keep a positive brand image, and that's hard to do during hard times. But I think just to just do right with their workers currently. A lot of the skilled migrants in a certain industry know each other, right? So there are different pools, whether it's in IT, whether it's engineering, whether it's in medicine. So I think just probably some really good advice is just to keep on top of providing really good HR support for your migrant workers, because that can go really far in terms of either helping with that next influx of recruitment, because everyone who's still working with you is happy to recommend their friends and their mentors in their home countries, or create a situation where sort of no one's putting their hand up to recommend anyone to come into New Zealand when the next boom happens.
And you're absolutely right when it comes to treat your employees well. It goes for anyone, of course, like whether on a visa or anything like that. But let's say hypothetically, if someone's on a part to residency visa or something like that, if you really, the last thing you really want is to support someone through that, and then as soon as they've got residency, they jump the fence and go somewhere else. So we do sometimes, unfortunately, we do see that. So treating people with an even playing field when it comes to salary parity and everything like that, I think is absolutely important. Absolutely. Okay. No, it's going to be certainly interesting to see how the next 12 months play out. Is there more to come, Shush, do you think? Do you think?
Oh, yeah, definitely.
There is? So, okay, yeah.
Well, like this is publicly available information. Yeah. So, within the coalition agreement, National and ACT had promised to remove the median wage rate and then rework the resident setting. So currently, there is a targeted consultation in regards to the Credit Employer Work Visa setting. I think that's publicly available knowledge, and there is. I think on the horizon, there's going to be a consultation or some work done into the resident setting, because at the moment it's a bit too rigid. There's lots of technical roles that are super skilled that sort of fall off. And let's say someone's got, let's say, a diploma and not a bachelor's qualification, and they're getting paid, let's say, under your 98K. It's quite hard for those workers to get to apply for residence unless they're working in a registration, an occupation that requires mandatory registration, like your electricians and so forth. So I think there's going to be even more changes that come about later next year and this year. And I think some of those changes will be tweaked more favorably for the sort of overall bigger migration picture. So it will hopefully help, employers in New Zealand attract more skilled labor, because I guess the tap will be loosened a little bit.
That makes sense. And I think it's a good segue into, from a potential candidate, someone who's looking to come into, a migrant coming into New Zealand, in terms of what advice we can give them from both of our respective professional fields when looking to do that. What do you think if you're a, let's say, a skilled IT worker, and you might be an expert in SAP S/4HANA or something like that? What would your advice be to someone looking to come into the country? And this is kind of starting that exploration, that journey about moving to New Zealand.
Well, Immigration New Zealand has actually some fantastic information online. So they've got information in regards to cost of living calculators and so forth, just to help with planning the move, just to understand how expensive New Zealand is at the moment, how much, so that they can also plan how much they need to earn, because it might not just be them, it might be their families. So there's some really good information that's available online. Work and live in New Zealand, immigration's website's fantastic. There's also I think specialists in terms of I think one of the first steps is probably to connect with a recruitment specialist. I think it's a fantastic step to take to help understand the local like New Zealand or Auckland or another sort of, if you're going to go more local, like let's say, or if you wanted to, for example, move into the South Island or something, to understand what roles are available locally, because that can potentially help with securing employment. Because at the moment, even though you've got like a super skilled, let's say, background in IT, if you're a migrant coming in, I think the toughest thing to do at the moment is to find that offer of employment that matches what you want and also ticks the boxes for you in terms of providing a positive migrant settlement package, in the sense that you come into New Zealand, you'll be able to tick the boxes to apply for residence, you'll be happy in your job, your family will be happy here, and that move that you make will last a bit longer, and hopefully be permanent.
Makes sense. And what I would add to that, look, knowledge is power, isn't it? Like, if you've got a specific skill set, let's continue with the IT example. So if you're a specialist in SAP S4HANA, it's kind of doing a bit of research, whether speaking to recruitment agencies like us at Beyond Recruitment, or whether going direct to the source or websites or whatever it may be, about who's running some implementations in that space currently. So then you can have some really targeted conversations or make some really targeted approaches. We do get a lot of people asking us for this kind of advice, and one thing I'm always saying to people is certainly keep your options open about who you're talking to, what kind of position you're willing to go into as well. The reality is New Zealand economy is, all relatively speaking, fairly small compared to some other markets, and so people might have to adjust. If you were a senior program manager in the UK, well, in New Zealand it might be not quite at that level, just because of the number of those kind of opportunities all relatively available. So keeping options open, I think, is certainly the good way to go. Okay, and moving back to the employer side, Shush, what's your advice to organisations to make sure they're striking a good balance of, having not putting all their eggs in one basket of too many migrant workers? Could leave them a bit vulnerable, but being able to, I guess, leverage the strengths or the potential opportunities that being open and using visa systems such as the AEWV present itself, but not putting the business in a vulnerable position for over-reliance on that. Any advice around that?
Yeah, so I think it's good to complete planning, and it's good to always test the labor market to see whether an employer is in a region where there is local talent available. But I guess if we were to sort of take a really big picture look at this, it's really important for employers to maintain a positive image with Immigration New Zealand. You don't want to be, for example, that employer that gets investigated, has an infringement sort of offence raised, and then sort of be barred from employing migrant workers for, like, let's say, a 6-month period, because that's going to be a pretty big red flag or red sticker that might be hard to remove. So at the moment, I guess with those employers that are that are in those hard to find Kiwi, are in those regions where you can't find a New Zealand citizen or resident visa holder to potentially work in a role, to just make sure that they're compliant with all the immigration requirements. So, for example, they're making sure they're paying all of their workers the required rate as per the rate set on their visas, that they're sending settlement information when they're onboarding staff, or even when they're supporting staff for, let's say, balance applications, ticking all the boxes in the senses that to make sure that requirements such as if workers do leave, there's a requirement now for employers that have sort of renewed their accreditation to communicate within 10 days when an accrued employee work visa holder has left, when they have more than a month left on their visa. So there's a long list of requirements that employers need to still keep on top of during this lull period, and I guess that's just for those employers where for those roles that they have, they're not going to find New Zealand citizens and resident visas holders because of, let's say, the region or the specialized nature of the role. So I guess for that part, I guess the importance is to just keep compliant. Now for the so I guess other employers where they might actually be able to find Kiwis to do those roles. I think it's important to understand the messaging from the government, and that messaging is, look, it's Kiwi, it's fill the role with a New Zealand citizen or resident visa priority one. And I think it's important to potentially align and start resonating with that messaging, because that is what the government is saying at the moment. And my understanding is there are a fair amount of Kiwis that need support. And if it's the case that, let's say, your migrant workers have visas that are expiring and they're working in roles where, look, they can't actually be supported for another visa, I think it's probably just important to get some professional advice, because there is a employment and immigration point of overlap there where I think consultations should be completed to explore options. And then if they take advice and it's the case that, look, the advice is the migrant workers can't be supported for another visa, a labour market test should be completed, and then Kiwis should be recruited into roles. I think that is a good line to take. Even though training might be required, you might not find the perfect candidate. I think it will line up better with the messaging that the government is sending, which is you have to prioritize recruiting your Kiwis.
The locals, that makes a lot of sense. So it's kind of like, in summary, it's like if you're an organisation, if they can get the complexities right or get their head around how it all works and do it properly, essentially. Sounds very simplistic, but follow the rules, do it properly. There's certainly advantages that and opportunities that organisations can leverage, and it is going to be it is always very contextual, isn't it, in terms of the industry and the need and specific setting.
Yeah. So, for example, like in your IT sort of setting, you'll probably the workers will probably be able to apply for residence. So that's why that sort of consult or professional advice might be helpful, because it might not be the end of the story for the migrant worker, right? They might be able to become a New Zealand resident and then settle in New Zealand, and that might be a pathway in itself. But that advice at that stage is probably quite important, just to understand what the next steps are, because it will be completely different if the person's, let's say, working an ANSCO skill level 4 or 5 role where there is no chance that they will be promoted into a more skilled role. And then, at that stage, the messaging would be, look, you probably need to test the labour market, engage a recruitment company, and then maybe find some good Kiwis to fill the role.
That makes sense. Look, thank you, Shush. As in, I think this has been a really valuable discussion, and something tells me, as I was referencing earlier, certainly not the last time we'll be having this discussion, I think, in terms of the need in the labour market for skilled migrant labour to come in to the country. It might sound a bit counterintuitive at the moment, given where the economy is at now, but I really do think, give it another 6 to 12 months, we might be facing almost similar settings to what we had just post COVID as well, when I just look at those net migration numbers. So this kind of advice is certainly going to be valuable for a lot of organisations, and I think for a lot of organisations and potential people looking to explore coming into New Zealand as well. It's probably worth considering these things or making these considerations sooner rather than later. So I really appreciated your time and thoughts. But final thoughts, final sign off, Shush.
Yeah, well, thanks for the time also, Grant. I guess final thoughts is, survive until 2025, and just I think Jacinda said it pretty well. Treat everyone with some respect and
be kind.
Yeah, be kind. Yeah, so I guess going back to what Jacinta was saying, just be kind. That's probably a good message to send, and also be kind and compliant with Immigration New Zealand, because it's really important if you're an employer to keep that positive image with Immigration New Zealand, because when the borders open up again, you don't want to be that employer that can't recruit your next cohort of let's say migrant staff because you've been banned or suspended from doing so for a period.
Very astute advice, and of course your details will be available to our listeners, so we'll be able to pass on your information for anyone who wants a bit more information regarding everything we've discussed today in visas, because it certainly is an evolving topic, and you're kept very busy having to keep abreast of all the changes that come through.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, and fingers crossed the change in next year will be quite favorable. Fingers crossed that, yeah, the median wage rate will be removed and there'll be some more favorable resident settings, which will be, positive for the hopeful sort of recovery.
Absolutely. Okay, well, look, thank you, Shush, and thank you to our listeners. Really appreciate you taking the time, and we look forward to discussing further topics in the future. Thank you.